So it's been a momentous few days in West Asia after the deaths of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, as well as a number of top Hezbollah commanders at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces. A momentous development in the politics of West Asia and an escalation in the conflict that we have seen so far between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah. Joining us now is Dr. Shany, who is a noted expert on Israeli defense and security. He's a lecturer at Reichman University. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about, and put this in context, what's happened over the last week or two? We began with these pager attacks that were seen a couple of weeks ago in Lebanon, and now we've seen recently attacks that have taken out the top leadership of Hezbollah. Could you put this in context? What is Israel thinking here in terms of its actions and its conflict strategy?
I think that what we saw over the course of 9 days was a dramatic operation, a rolling operation to essentially dismantle almost entirely Hezbollah as an effective military organization and as a de facto ruling militia of southern Lebanon and a leading partner in the governance of Lebanon as a state. Each of these things sounds like one little bit of tactical brilliance, but I think the best way analytically is to think about it as a rolling operation, as a 9-day war where each part contributed to the next. Mm-hmm. Whether it was the beepers, then the walkie-talkies, which handicapped the communications network and took out a whole cadre of crucial fighters and support networks for Hezbollah, whether it was then the targeted assassinations of a few of the leading brigade commanders, whether it was then the destruction of rocket launchers, and then ultimately which forced the remaining Hezbollah leadership to convene in person in a bunker underneath an apartment building, which, as far as I can tell, had largely been evacuated at that point because of earlier Israeli warnings about the entire Dahya neighborhood, which resulted in the successful operation that Israel carried out a few nights ago, eliminating both Nasrallah and, by the latest account, at least 20 senior members of Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. Put together, that's an astonishing effort and a real turnaround, a dramatic shift in the basic contours of a war that's been going on Israel's northern border since October 8th, but in the larger war of the Iranian-led ring of fire that's surrounded Israel and been actively engaged in hostile action since October 7th, nearly 1 year ago.
Right. Could I ask you, Dr. Moore, to lay out for us what Israel is looking to do? You mentioned that that Israel has been essentially at war since October 7th last year. It's, of course, taken these actions over the last year to degrade the military capacities of Hamas as well as Hezbollah. What does the future, what does the next 6 months look like for Israel in the best case scenario? What is Israel hoping to do? We know that France and the United States are pushing for a ceasefire. Is that something that Israel will be comfortable accepting at this point in time? Or is it that Israel wants to further degrade the military capacities of groups like Hezbollah and Hamas?
I mean, Israel has real political and diplomatic goals on both of these fronts. A ceasefire is useful if it helps advance those goals, and not useful if it doesn't, and counterproductive if it actually retards those goals. Israel's important goals right now are to degrade and destroy as much as possible the fighting capacity of both Hamas and Hezbollah, to achieve a security situation that allows the more than 100,000 Israelis that have had to evacuate their homes in both the south and the north to come home, and to recover the hostages that were taken from their homes and from a party on the morning of October 7th.
Understood.
These goals are difficult to attain. Some of the methods that are used to achieve one actively harm the other. A ceasefire can help for some of those goals. It can harm others. It depends which ones and what the hierarchy of them is and what the timing of it is. For example, a ceasefire on the Gaza front last November resulted in the recovery of about 50 living hostages and didn't actually involve a very severe tactical price for Israel. It put the war on hold for a few days. It meant that drone surveillance of Gaza had to be stopped during the days when hostages were released. There was a cost, but the benefit far outweighed the cost. It's very possible that there could be a similar deal in Gaza as well. A ceasefire with Hezbollah, especially the one that the United States and France were trying to push in the day before the successful operation in Adahia, would have been counterproductive for the goals that Israel was trying to achieve.
Understood.
I think that's obvious now.
Right. Could I ask you to comment a little bit on the state of the domestic politics in Israel? We know that over the last year or so, it's been a difficult political situation, first with the judicial reforms, and then especially after the October 7th attacks. And there were serious questions being asked about the political position of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Could you tell us a little bit about whether you think that whether the needle has moved in any way on Netanyahu's public reputation, especially in light of these successful operations to take out Hezbollah leaders like Nasarallah? Have things changed for Netanyahu?
I suspect the needle has moved a tiny bit in his direction over the last couple of days, but I don't think that changes the underlying dynamic. The government that came into power at the end of 2022 with an 8-seat majority in parliament, but effectively a 30,000 vote majority in the election, which is tiny, infinitesimal, mismanaged the country in such a catastrophic way in the year between their assuming power on December 31st, 2022, and the outbreak of this horrible war on the 7th of October. I don't think that there's much they can do to recover their standing, which is why they've been so eager to stave off any demands for both an election and a state commission of inquiry. This moves the needle a bit in his direction. This doesn't change the underlying dynamic. I suspect that the best that Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition can hope for in an election is not winning, but having some kind of blocking majority that would result in a new round of elections and keep them in as caretakers. I don't know. The thing about a war as complicated as this and with so many fronts as this one and so many moving parts is that it's unpredictable. Only 1 month ago, the public mood here was one of despair. I would say that the low point was the morning after we discovered that the 6 hostages in the Gaza tunnel had been murdered. Right now, the mood has shifted a bit because we've had a spate of good news from our side and because we've had a few successful operations from the IDF. But that can change back and forth still many, many times.
Right. Could I ask you, in terms of the Israeli opposition, what's their sense of what moves on? We of course heard some opposition leaders sort of call on Israel to accept France and America's call for a ceasefire. Could you talk a little bit about the domestic political scene outside of the ruling coalition? What is the opposition thinking more broadly about how to carry forward this conflict? And if I could ask you to perhaps expand a little bit on what the general public is thinking about levels of support, what the public wants. I know that hostages, for example, return of hostages has been a top priority. Could you talk to us a little bit about what the opposition seems to want in terms of taking the conflict forward and what the general public wants in terms of priorities?
Sure. The opposition, first of all, is not a one coherent united force that speaks with one voice. It contains lots of rather diverse parties with a very diverse set of perspectives and interests on the conflict and on domestic politics as well. I don't think that many of the major opposition leaders were actively calling for a ceasefire on the northern front in Lebanon, or endorsing the US and French proposal. In fact, a few of them have called for even more aggressive action. Where they differ is on the question of Gaza and the necessity of reaching any kind of deal right now, however big the price is, to recover as many hostages as we can. I think there's a real difference between the mainstream of the Israeli opposition, the center and center-left of the Israeli political map, and the right-wing and far-right-wing of the current coalition. Everybody wants to get hostages. Everybody's willing to pay some price, but it's quite clear that the government regards the conduct of the war and the larger mission of defeating Hamas to be a much higher priority than recovering the hostages, even if they don't say that clearly. And it's quite clear that most of the opposition regards recovering hostages, even at the cost, even at a high tactical cost to the rest of the war effort, as a higher priority, even if they don't feel comfortable spelling it out like that. But there is a clear political and ideological cleavage in the Israeli elite opinion and public opinion. And there's an obvious sociological aspect to it too, which isn't just ideological. Most of the hostages are people who were at a rave festival on a Saturday morning, people who lived in a kibbutz. They're not the constituency of a mostly religious and right-wing government.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit in terms of the international scene that has been developing over the last couple of days and weeks? There have been questions about continued arms sales to Israel from countries like the United Kingdom. Of course, America has had significant debate about whether there should be continued sale of arms. So far, of course, the Biden administration has continued those sales. Is there a sense in Israel about international support? How is Israel looking at the international scene? The United Nations General Assembly happened recently. There was lots of debate, sometimes criticism as well of Israel for what's been going on. How are Israelis looking at the international conversation that's developing around what's been happening in Gaza? Is it are they indignant at it, or could I get you a sense of a reaction from the Israeli public in terms of what the international conversation has been?
Sure. I'm a bit older than you, and I've been around for a while. There has never been any military encounter that Israel's had in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Iraq, in Tunisia, in Sudan, anywhere that has not been met with cries of war crime, collective punishment, demands for tribunals, etc. It's very hard to reach Israeli public opinion, except for the most hardened corners of the left, with international criticism or pious invocations of international law that are often very selective and based on no existing laws of any kind. It's hard to have any effect on how the Israeli public sees that when every single time we have defended ourselves, we have been criticized in these hyperbolic terms. And when the same critics have almost nothing to say about the attacks on Israel. Regarding the practical aspect of your question, almost all of Israel's weapons purchases are from the United States, and a few crucial systems that come from Germany too. These declarations by other countries, some of whom purchase more weapons from Israel than they sell, are at best performative and probably self-sabotaging. They don't actually have an effect on the course of events here. I suspect, though, that there will be, in the coming years, a ramping up of domestic production of munitions as part of the lesson learning of this conflict. But as far as Israel is concerned, when it comes to weapons systems, we focus on what they're saying in Washington and a little bit on what they say in Berlin, and most of the rest of the world is tuned out.
Understood. Could I ask you two final questions, Dr. Moore? The first one is on the situation on the hostages. Could you update us and bring us to speed on what has developed on that front, the Israeli government's efforts to bring those hostages back? There are, of course, talks about a deal that would allow, let's say, Palestinian prisoners to be exchanged for Israeli hostages. Could you give us a sense of what has been happening on that front over the last couple of weeks and months?
It's very hard for me as an observer to tell what's happening on that front. We don't have a deal. We have in the Israeli public an enormous amount of anger at our government for not succeeding in getting a deal. I don't know that at any point in time there has been a deal on the table from Hamas. So as an observer, I don't. It's very hard for me to draw any conclusive findings from this. Whenever we've come close to a deal or seem to be coming towards a deal, it's turned out that Hamas doesn't actually want to have one. And I'm not sure from their perspective how it would advance their interest. At a minimum, they want to hold on to some hostages. It's their only insurance policy in this war at all. You see the difference between what Hezbollah has faced and what Hamas has faced in that sense. If there is a deal, if there is any possibility of recovering these people who are sitting at home and having coffee on a Saturday morning with their families and grabbed and taken away, many of them saw their own family members murdered before they themselves were abducted, and have spent almost a year now in tunnels in unimaginably inhumane conditions. If there's any way of recovering them, then I hope that that this government and the international community do what they can to recover them, hopefully without incentivizing too much future abductions. I'm unconvinced that the government of Israel has done everything possible to recover them.
Right. And if I could ask
but
you...
I'm also unconvinced that there has actually been a serious deal at any point on the table.
Understood. And my last question to you, Dr. Moore, is in terms of what you see the conflict developing as, at the risk of asking you to repeat yourself, in the next 3 to 6 months, do you see any prospects for a ceasefire or a reduction in hostilities, or do you believe that a significant escalation could be likely, perhaps more Iranian involvement? Forgive me for asking you to crystal ball gaze a little bit, but your sense of how the conflict will develop in the coming months?
I don't have any special predictive powers. There are scenarios of escalation that are certainly possible, particularly if violence explodes on the West Bank. And there are certainly actors on all sides of this conflict who are interested in seeing something like that happen because they believe it can work to their advantage. I think that they're all horribly wrong. There's also a scenario of an escalation between Israel and Iran. I think for the Iranians, and specifically for the Iranian nuclear program, the threat of Hezbollah on Israel's northern border was their only real shield. The Iranians' offensive capabilities to attack and harm Israel, as we saw in April, are much less than what they wanted the world to believe. And what was deterring over the last decade a significant Israeli attack on their nuclear facilities was the Israeli fear of Hezbollah. If in this 9-day campaign, Israel has genuinely succeeded in removing the threat of Hezbollah, the strategic threat of Hezbollah, not the nuisance that they've managed to present in the last week, that leaves the Iranian nuclear facilities completely exposed. And that's something that both Israel and the United States will have to take seriously as they weigh their future moves.
Understood.
At the same time, there's a possibility that we reach another ceasefire, maybe only a temporary one in Gaza, so that we can recover as many living hostages as possible. The time for them is running out.
Dr. Moore, thank you so much for sitting down with us and explaining where the conflict is in West Asia at this point in time, how the Israeli public is seeing what's happening, the situation on the hostages, as well as the domestic political situation with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his governing coalition. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for joining us, and thank you so much.
Having me.
Thank you so much for watching India Today Global.